Chapter 2. The Gathering of the Dead. The departure of Noster and his pupils occurred in the late spring of 1281, during the interlunar dark. Afterwards, a new moon waxed above the flowery fields and bright-leafed woods, and waned in ghostly silver. With its waning, people began to talk of other magicians and fresher mysteries. Then, in the moon-deserted nights of early summer, there came a series of disappearances far more unnatural and inexplicable than that of the dwarfish, malignant necromancer. It was found one day by gravediggers who had gone early to their toil in a cemetery outside the walls of Dijon that no less than 6 newly occupied graves had been opened, and the bodies, which were those of reputable citizens, removed. On closer examination, it became all too evident that this removal had not been effected by robbers. The coffins, which lay aslant or stood protruding upright from the mould, offered all the appearance of having been shattered from within, as if by the use of extra-human strength, and the fresh earth itself was upheaved, as if the dead men, in some awful, untimely resurrection, had actually dug their way to the surface. The corpses had vanished utterly, as if hell had swallowed them, and, as far as could be learned, there were no eyewitnesses of their fate. In those devil-ridden times, only one explanation of the happening seemed credible. Demons had entered the graves and taken bodily possession of the dead, compelling them to arise and go forth. To the dismay and horror of all Auvergne, the strange vanishment was followed with appalling promptness by many others of a like sort. It seemed as if an occult, resistless summons had been laid upon the dead. Nightly, for a period of 2 weeks, the cemeteries of Dijon, and also those of other towns, of villages and hamlets, gave up a ghastly quota of their tenants. From brazen-bolted tombs, from common charnels, from shallow, unconsecrated trenches, from the marble-lidded vaults of churches and cathedrals, the weird exodus went on without cessation. Worse than this, if possible, there were newly ceremented corpses that leapt from their biers or catafalques, and, disregarding the horrified watchers, ran with great bounds of automatic frenzy into the night, never to be seen again by those who lamented them. In every case, the missing bodies were those of young, stalwart men who had died but recently, and had met their death through violence or accident, rather than wasting illness. Some were criminals who had paid the penalty of their misdeeds. Others were men-at-arms or constables slain in the execution of their duty. Knights who had died in tourney or personal combat were numbered among them, and many were the victims of the robber bands who infested Auvergne at that time. There were monks, merchants, nobles, yeomen, pages, priests, but none, in any case, who had passed the prime of life. The old and infirm, it seemed, were safe from the animating demons. The situation was looked upon by the more superstitious as a veritable omening of the world's end. Satan was making war with his cohorts, and was carrying the bodies of the holy dead into hellish captivity. The consternation increased 100-fold when it became plain that even the most liberal sprinkling of holy water, the performance of the most awful and cogent exorcisms, failed utterly to give protection against this diabolic ravishment. The Church owned itself powerless to cope with the strange evil, and the forces of secular law could do nothing to arraign or punish the intangible agency. Because of the universal fear that prevailed, no effort was made to follow the missing cadavers. Ghastly tales, however, were told by late wayfarers who had met certain of these liches striding alone or in companies along the roads of Auvergne. They gave the appearance of being deaf, dumb, totally insensate, and of hurrying with horrible speed and sureness toward a remote, predestined goal. The general direction of their flight, it seemed, was eastward, but only with the cessation of the exodus, which had numbered several hundred people, did anyone begin to suspect the actual destination of the dead. This destination, it somehow became rumored, was the ruinous castle of Ylourgne, beyond the werewolf-haunted forest, in the outlying semi-mountainous hills of Auvergne. Ylourgne, a great craggy pile that had been built by a line of evil and marauding barons now extinct, was a place that even the goatherds preferred to shun. The wrathful spectres of its bloody lords were said to move turbulently in its crumbling halls, and its chatelaines were the undead. No one cared to dwell in the shadow of its cliff-founded walls, and the nearest abode of living men was a small Cistercian monastery, more than a mile away on the opposite slope of the valley. The monks of this austere brotherhood held little commerce with the world beyond the hills, and few were the visitors who sought admission at their high-perched portals. But during that dreadful summer, following the disappearances of the dead, a weird and disquieting tale went forth from the monastery throughout Auvergne. Beginning with late spring, the Cistercian monks were compelled to take cognizance of sundry odd phenomena in the old, long-deserted ruins of Ylourgne, which were visible from their windows. They had beheld flaring lights, where lights should not have been, flames of uncanny blue and crimson that shuddered behind the broken, weed-grown embrasures, or rose starward above the jagged crenellations. Hideous noises had issued from the ruin by night, together with the flames, and the monks had heard a clangor as of hellish anvils and hammers, a ringing of gigantic armor and maces, and had deemed that Ylourgne was become a mustering ground of devils. Mephitic odors, as of brimstone and burning flesh, had floated across the valley, and even by day, when the noises were silent and the lights no longer flared, a thin haze of hell-blue vapor hung upon the battlements. It was plain, the monks thought, that the place had been occupied from beneath by subterrestrial beings, for no one was seen to approach it by way of the bare, open slopes and crags. Observing these signs of the arch-foe's activity in their neighborhood, they crossed themselves with new fervor and frequency, and said their paters and aves more interminably than before. Their toils and austerities also they redoubled. Otherwise, since the old castle was a place abandoned by men, they took no heed of the supposed occupation, deeming it well to mind their own affairs, unless in case of overt satanic hostility. They kept a careful watch, but for several weeks they saw no one who actually entered Ylourgne or emerged therefrom. Except for the nocturnal lights and noises and the hovering vapor by day, there was no proof of tenants, either human or diabolic. Then, one morning, in the valley below the terraced gardens of the monastery, two brothers, hoeing weeds in a carrot patch, beheld the passing of a singular train of people who came from the direction of the great forest of Auvergne, and went upward, climbing the steep chasmy slope of Ylourgne. These people, the monks averred, were striding along in great haste, with stiff but flying steps, and all were strangely pale of feature, and were habited in the garments of the grave. The shrouds of some were torn and ragged, and all were dusty with travel, or grimed with the mould of interment. The people numbered a dozen or more, and after them, at intervals, there came several stragglers, attired like the rest. With marvelous agility and speed, they mounted the hill, and disappeared at length amid the lowering walls of Ylourgne. At this time, no rumor of the ravished graves and biers had reached the Cistercians. The tale was brought to them later, after they had beheld, on many successive mornings, the passing of small or great companies of the dead toward the devil-taken castle. Hundreds of these liches, they swore, had filed beneath the monastery, and doubtless many others had gone past unnoted in the dark. None, however, were seen to come forth from Ylourgne, which had swallowed them up like the undisgorging pit. Though direly frightened and sorely scandalized, the brothers still thought it well to refrain from action. Some, the hardiest, irked by all these flagrant signs of evil, had desired to visit the ruins with holy water and lifted crucifixes. But their abbot, in his wisdom, enjoined them to wait. In the meanwhile, the nocturnal flames grew brighter, the noises louder. Also, in the course of this waiting, while incessant prayers went up from the little monastery, a frightful thing occurred. One of the brothers, a stout fellow named Theophile, in violation of the rigorous discipline, had made over-frequent visits to the wine casks. No doubt he had tried to drown his pious horror at these untoward happenings. At any rate, after his potations, he had the ill luck to wander out among the precipices and break his neck. Sorrowing for his death and dereliction, the brothers laid Theophile in the chapel and chanted their masses for his soul. These masses, in the dark hours before morning, were interrupted by the untimely resurrection of the dead monk, who, with his head lolling horribly on his broken neck, rushed, as if fiend-ridden, from the chapel, and ran down the hill towards the demon flames and clamours of Ylourgne.